Of all the counties of Britain, perhaps the most celebrated for its wildlife is Norfolk. From the Wash in the northwest to the Broads, from the North Norfolk coast to the Brecks, everywhere there is rare and special wildlife. And protecting it since 1926 is Norfolk Wildlife Trust, which today is engaged in a national programme called Living Landscapes. Living Landscapes are about restoring habitat where it exists, recreating habitat where it has been lost, and reconnecting areas of isolated habitat. Crucially, it's also about reconnecting people with the landscapes they inhabit. Across this series, we'll be exploring the living landscapes of our county, meeting the people who are helping to restore them, and learning about the rare wildlife which inhabits them. This is Wild Norfolk. Acquired in 1926, Cley Marshes is the oldest wildlife trust reserve in the country. For 90 years it's been a favourite of both birds and of people who love birds, celebrated for the diversity of its wildlife. Behind me are the natural Blakeney salt marshes, and to my right the freshwater marshes of Cley. These were created in the 17th century by embankment, big banks being built around the west, east and north of the reserve to prevent the twice-daily incursion of the tide. With the saltwater no longer coming in, the land became a freshwater marsh fed by freshwater springs in the underlying late Cretaceous chalk. This meant better grazing for agriculture and in time came to be one of the nation's best-loved nature reserves. This existed for several hundred years, but in the late 20th century and early 21st century, increasingly powerful storms hit the East Anglian coast. In November 2007, a massive storm hit the North Norfolk coast. Parts of the shingle ridge were breached and thousands of tons of shingle were pushed onto the north of the reserve, burying large parts of it, including this Second World War pillbox. In the wake of these storms, the Environment Agency, which manages our British coastlines, decided it was no longer sustainable to shore up the northern shingle ridge at Cley Marshes each winter and to allow it to adopt a more natural profile.
So the appearance and the biology of the reserve at its northern edge is going to change now. It's going to become more saline. The influence of the sea is pushing inland, but it's a long, slow process. So as the shingle moves, it moves the effect of the salt water closer and closer to the drainage systems we have on the reserve, and so therefore we have to move those drainage systems inland to keep the salt and the freshwater influences separate on the reserve. So the shape of the bank has changed. There's a lot more bare shingle. Shingle moves every winter now. There's a legal obligation on the Environment Agency to provide compensatory habitat for the very important freshwater habitats which are going to be lost through this movement of the saline influence and the shingle ridge inland. So the positive that's come out of this is that the Environment Agency, Natural England, the Wildlife Trust have teamed up to create a huge piece of new wetland in the Fens, a place called Hilgey, where there's well over 200 acres of new reed bed being created, basically to provide a habitat for the marsh harriers, the bitterns, breeding bitterns that are going to get displaced from this habitat and their freshwater requirements.
I've come to the Wissy Valley Living Landscape to talk to Matt Blissett, Brecks Reserve's manager for Norfolk Wildlife Trust, to find out what he and his colleagues have achieved here. So Matt, you're now in charge of the Wissy Valley Living Landscape. Tell me what's been achieved here and how it's been achieved.
Construction started here in 2010. The first thing that was constructed here was the lagoon, the holding lagoon.
That we see behind us.
That's right. So that fundamentally holds the water that can then, during the summer, during the drier months, can sustain the reed beds and the wet grassland, so we can maintain that wetland.
The wet habitat that we're replacing from Cley. Where does the water come from?
It comes from the river here, the Wissey,
Ah.
hence the Wissey living landscapes.
Excellent. You talked about the water from the lagoons going out into the reed beds. How do you make a reed bed?
Well, you have to hold the water there, so you have to have that wetland initially, so hence the water from the lagoon. But we've planted reed rhizomes, we've also planted reed plugs, and also from reed stems.
And you maintain the level of the water in the reed bed to make it perfect for the species that you want to live there?
Yeah, one thing for early establishing reed is it doesn't like that fluctuation in water level. So by having the lagoon and being able to sort of supplement water into these, when it dries out, we can maintain it at the same level.
And in the context of wildlife conservation in the UK, how special is this? What's been achieved here?
Well, this is 131 hectares of wetland creation, where probably one of the largest wetland creation areas within the country.
And what are the key targets? When's it going to be the case that Matt says, yes, we've done good?
Well, we already have the two target species for obviously reed bed loss on the North Norfolk coast are marsh harrier and bittern. And we've hopefully, to test whether or not we've done the right thing here, we're looking for 3 breeding bittern, pairs of breeding bittern, and likewise for marsh harrier, and we already have marsh harrier hunting over this area.
Fantastic. So watch this space.
Well, we'd always been looking at areas in the fens to recreate wetlands, and this was a golden opportunity really, that the land was being sold, the farmer couldn't do anything with it, and we had thoughts that it could be turned into a reed bed. Well, at the time we looked at this piece of land, it was the time when the floods had hit Cley Nature Reserve, and it was realised then that we really had to find a replacement for the reed bed there. We had to look at the land and look in detail at the levels of the land and where the water was and where it would lie if it rained, and we had to sort of start thinking about where to dig ditches and how we would supply water to the wetland and create the pools that the wildlife required. We had to employ a company that had massive diggers that were normally used in the construction industry for civil engineering works, so they came on site, and they were on site for nearly 2 years, building the bunds that created the reservoir, digging the ditches and the pools. From my point of view, the thing that's really thrilled me in walking around the site is seeing how the little patches of reed have expanded from where we planted them, and just seeing them being colonised by different birds each year. As the reeds have grown and expanded, more birds have moved into these little patches, and it's been really, really thrilling to see birds that have flown all the way from Africa suddenly sort of diving into a little patch of reed and starting to sing and build a nest.
Traditionally, nature conservation has been about acquiring nature reserves, places which are still wild with many species living in them, and protecting those sites. But as we can see here in the Wissey Valley living landscape, Norfolk Wildlife Trust is now turning back the clock, recreating areas that have been lost. Here, a wetland with reed beds and wet grazing marshes. Elsewhere in the county, other projects are following the same model. In the Broads at Potter Heigham, Norfolk Wildlife Trust is creating a large area of reed bed that will be home to bitterns, to marsh harriers, and we hope perhaps cranes. Also in the Broads at Upton, wet grazing marshes are being recreated. And in northwest Norfolk at Grimston Warren, a large area of heathland has been restored. This is the model under which Norfolk Wildlife Trust will continue protecting the wildlife of Norfolk across the county.
Well, the lovely thing about Cley is that you can easily come here and see a whole range of amazing species to watch. You know, with your guidebook, you can use any one of the 4 hides that we have across the site, easy to get to, and you look straight out onto some fantastic wetland scrapes and marsh areas, which are just full of birds all year. You know, and it changes through the migration periods, but they've always got birds on. It's a great spot to come to where you're not going to disturb wildlife, but you really can get up close to it and witness it firsthand.
As Kevin has told us, Cley Marshes remains a vibrant freshwater marsh. Each year it attracts hundreds of thousands of migrant birds and nesting birds. Each year it attracts more than 100,000 people. To find out more yourselves about Norfolk Wildlife Trust and its network of nature reserves across the county, visit the Norfolk Wildlife Trust website.